This is Chapter 11, Personality. In the first section, we'll look at the definition of personality and some of the history of the theories of personality. So personality is defined as long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. Some of the early perspectives about personality include believing that personality is shaped by bodily fluids, or what was referred to as humors. Hippocrates believed that there was a choleric temperament, a melancholic temperament, a sanguine temperament, and a phlegmatic temperament, and that these temperaments again were influenced by the bodily fluids that coincide with them. Galen expanded on Hippocrates' theory. He believed that diseases and personality differences were influenced due to imbalances in the humors, and he believed that everyone would display the corresponding temperaments that Hippocrates identified. Gall believed in phrenology, and this was a belief that was very popular for a long time. He believed that you could gauge personality, character, mental abilities based on the distance between the bumps on the skull. This has been dismissed now as pseudoscience. It was also used as justification for claims of racial biological determinism. Kant expanded the theories of Galen. He created lists of traits that corresponded with the four temperaments. And then Wundt expanded Galen and Kant's theories by saying that personality was defined by acknowledging the traits along two major axes. And this is similar to trait theory that's in our modern theory of personality. So he said those two major axes were emotional, non-emotional, and changeable, unchangeable. And finally, Freud introduced the first comprehensive theory of personality, believed that unconscious drives and childhood sexuality would shape personality. The Neo-Freudians are people who were students of Freud who largely kept his initial ideas about unconscious urges, but did away with his emphasis on sexuality. Our modern perspectives of personality that we'll explore in this chapter include a learning perspective, a humanistic perspective, biological perspective, evolutionary perspective, trait perspective, which is the most popular and dominant, and then we'll also explore how we look at it through the lens of culture. So we'll start by looking at Freud's theory a little more closely. You learned about this a bit already in the development chapter. Freud believed that personality was made up of three different parts, the id, the ego, and the superego. And he believed that the bulk of that personality was below the surface of our awareness or unconscious. So conscious refers to our mental activity, our thoughts, our feelings, and our memories that we can access at any time, meaning that we are aware of. Unconscious refers to the mental activities that we are not aware of, and so we're not able to access them. Those three parts of the personality, as Freud defined them, again, the id, the ego, and the superego, follow. The id is believed to be an aspect of a personality that consists of our most primitive drives, our urges, including impulses for hunger, thirst, and sex. So I usually tell people that the id is kind of like a toddler. It is seeking and it is wanting, and its only concern is satisfying its wants, its needs, its desires. The ego is an aspect of the personality that represents the self, or the part of oneself's personality that is visible to others. Essentially, the ego tries to make peace between the id and the superego. The superego is the aspect of the personality that serves as one's moral compass or conscience, and the foundation for that moral compass and conscience is based on human experience. So we get rules from caretakers, from society, from social norms, and we establish those as kind of an internal rule book for what is okay and what is not okay. So the id wants, the superego checks those wants against what is considered appropriate based on what that person has experienced, and then the ego tries to satisfy the wants of the id without offending the superego. Neuroses is the tendency to experience negative emotions. And again, remember that Freud believed those negative emotions or internal conflict would occur when there was a difference, a conflicting difference between our conscious and our unconscious desires. So remember again from the development chapter that Freud had a theory of psychosexual development. He believed again that these phases, these stages, and how we progress through them would shape our personality, our traits, our behavior, and our thinking. Again, as a reminder, those stages are the oral stage from around birth to 1 to 2 years, the anal stage from around 2 to 3 years usually, the phallic stage between 3 to 6, the latency stage between 6 to 12, and then the genital stage from puberty onward. Freud also had a very interesting theory about what we would do when there was conflict between, again, our conscious and unconscious desires. He believed that to relieve the anxiety that we would experience when that inner conflict occurred, that we would adopt different defense mechanisms. None of these are believed to be healthy or effective, but they are essentially things that protect us from our ego or the breakdown, again, between our conscious and unconscious desires. So the first defense mechanism is denial, and this is refusing to accept real events because they are unpleasant. The example they give us is that Kayla refuses to admit that she has an alcohol problem, although she is unable to go to a single day without drinking excessively. The next one is displacement, and this is transferring inappropriate urges or behaviors onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. The example they give is during lunch at a restaurant, Mark is angry at his older brother but does not express it and instead is verbally abusive to the server. Projection is attributing unacceptable desires to others. The example they give is that Chris often cheats on her boyfriend because she suspects he is already cheating on her. Rationalization is justifying behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable reasons, real reasons. Kim failed his history course because he did not study or attend class, but he told his roommates that he failed because the professor didn't like him. Reaction formation is reducing anxiety by adopting beliefs contrary to your own beliefs. Nadia is angry with her coworker, Beth, for always arriving late to work after a night of partying, but she is nice and agreeable to Beth and affirms that partying is cool. Regression is returning to coping strategies for less mature stages of development. So this means earlier, usually infantile phases of development. After failing to pass his doctoral examinations, Giorgio spends days in bed cuddling his favorite childhood toy. Repression is suppressing painful memories and thoughts. This is a very controversial idea that has largely been debunked within psychology. Lachey cannot remember her grandfather's fatal heart attack, although she was present. Sublimation refers to redirecting unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. Jerome's desire for revenge on the drunk driver who killed his son is channeled into a community support group for people who've lost loved ones to drunk driving. Next, we'll look at what we refer to as neo-Freudians. These are people who initially were students or followers of Freudian theory, but then kind of broke off and kept the kind of inherent part of Freud's work, but added their own ideas to it as well. The first is Alfred Adler. Adler introduced an idea of individual psychology. This is a school of psychology that focuses on our drive to compensate for feelings of inferiority. So you may have heard the term before, inferiority complex. Adler said that our feelings of inferiority, or feeling that we don't have value or worth, don't measure up to others or society's standards, would shape the way that we think and the way that we feel, essentially our personality. So essentially, if someone doesn't feel worthy, they will behave in lots of very interesting or odd ways because they feel that they are not accepted. Next, we'll look at Erikson. You've already been introduced to Erikson's ideas through, again, the lifespan development chapter. Remember that Erikson said that our development, in this case our personality, would be shaped by the way that we move through different stages of task development. Again, those stages were to establish trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity. If we didn't successfully move through those stages, then instead we would establish mistrust, shame and doubt, guilt, inferiority, confusion, isolation, stagnation, and despair. You've seen a little bit about Carl Jung in previous chapters. He was a very famous follower of Freud. Jung introduced the idea of analytic psychology, and so this is his theory focusing on the balance of opposing forces within one's personality and the significance of the collective unconscious. We've seen this term before in a previous chapter. Collective unconscious again refers to common psychological tendencies that have been passed down from one generation to the next. Jung actually believed that these were passed down biologically. He also said that there were archetypes that we could find throughout generations, and these are patterns that exist in our collective unconscious across cultures and societies. One of the things that is most influential in Jung's work is the introduction of the idea of introversion and extroversion as part of personality characteristics. Next, we look at Karen Horney. She was the first woman to be trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst. She later moved away from Freud's theories as many of the other neo-Freudians. She believed in the ability to self-actualize and disagreed with Freud's views towards girls and women. She focused on the role of unconscious anxiety in particular and attempts to relieve that anxiety. Horney believed that we would take 3 different coping styles to try to relieve the anxiety that we experienced. The first being to move toward people, and so this is a dependency. So the example they give is a child seeking positive attention and affection from a parent, or an adult needing love. So lots of attention seeking and needing approval from others to feel safe and less anxious. The next is moving against people. This is noted by aggression and manipulation. The example they give is a child fighting or bullying other children, or an adult who is abrasive and verbally hurtful or who exploits others. And finally, Horney said that the last one would be moving away from people. And so this would be identified through detached and isolated behaviors. The example they give us is a child who's withdrawn from the world and isolated, or an adult who is a loner. We'll look now at the learning perspective of personality. Remember that the behaviorists emphasize behavior over cognition. So they do not believe in biological determinism. They view personality as significantly shaped by the reinforcements and consequences outside of the organism, meaning, again, the consequences for behavior. Think of operant conditioning, okay? We learn to behave in particular ways under the behavioral perspective, and Skinner in particular disagreed with Freud that personality was fixed in childhood. Under the social cognitive perspective, which you were previously introduced to, particularly the ideas of Bandura, the social cognitive theory is a theory of personality that emphasizes both cognition and learning as a source of individual difference in personality. And the idea of reciprocal determinism is the belief that one's environment can determine behavior, but at the same time that people can influence the environment with both their thoughts and behaviors. So for example, if someone is someone who smiles all the time, they are going to impact their environment through that behavior. People are likely to be kinder to them because they are smiling and they are being open. And that will shape behaviors. People will be nicer to them because they are smiling, and they are also likely to be more smiley and kind and open if people are being nice to them. So it's a cyclical relationship. Self-efficacy is the individual belief and ability. So your ability to believe that you can overcome obstacles, or that you can take initiative and complete tasks. That's your level of self-efficacy. Julian Rotter introduced the idea of locus of control, and this is a very interesting and influential idea in personality development. Locus of control is the belief about your power over your life, and an external locus of control is the belief that your outcomes are based on what you do, and on what others do, excuse me. An internal locus of control is the belief that your outcomes are based on what you do. So if you have an internal locus of control, then you believe that you make things happen. If you have an external locus of control, then you believe that things happen to you. In general, an internal locus of control is going to be associated with greater success, psychologically and otherwise. In general, an external locus of control is going to be associated with a victim-like mentality. We look now at Walter Mischel and the person-situation debate. I find Mischel's ideas in particular to be very interesting because there actually is a lot of research to support his ideas, though his theory of personality is not necessarily considered the dominant one. You may have heard of the marshmallow test before. The results of the marshmallow test are widely reported in ways that are at odds with the way that the actual researcher interpreted his own results. So when you have time, I strongly encourage you to listen to the podcast, the Invisibilia podcast that I've placed under the chapter folder, so that you can get a greater understanding of his perspective. So the findings of Walter Mischel were that it's not personality that is consistent and persistent over time, but the situations that we are in that tend to be consistent. When placed in different situations, he found that the traits that were thought to be consistent and stable over time may not actually be, that they can actually change if the situation changes. So a way to kind of think of this is, your personality and how you think you respond day to day is likely because you are experiencing the same people or types of people in the same situation or types of situation day to day. When those things change, your character or your personality also tends to change. So if you think of times when you act out of character, this is an expression that we tend to use. You tend to act out of character when you are in a new situation or placed with a new person, different person than what you're normally used to dealing with. He also introduced the concept of self-regulation. This is really the heart of that marshmallow test. Self-regulation is essentially just willpower, the ability to delay gratification in particular. He said that people are situation processors, and so that the way that we would experience a situation would be through our perception of it. Remember, perception is very individual. It's not reality, but our individual reality. And so Mischel said that the way that we perceive an event would then dictate our actual behavior versus us having a, again, stable and persistent way of being. If you want to see a video of the marshmallow test, it's just a cute video to see, really. I'll post it as well in the chapter folder. We'll look now at the humanistic approach. All right, now that you have your list, let's talk about what that means. The humanistic approach to personality focuses on self-concept, and this is just our thoughts and our feelings about ourselves. And they say it's really important for self-esteem and personality development. The ideal self is the person that we would like to be. So this is the list of ideal traits that you made, that second list. The real self is who we actually are, or who we actually see ourselves to be. So that's the first list that you made. Congruence refers to a state of being in which our thoughts about our real and ideal selves are very similar, and incongruence refers to a state of being in which there's a great discrepancy or difference between our real and our ideal selves. In general, your self-esteem is going to be higher the closer your belief about your real and ideal selves are, and the further apart those ideas are, then the lower your self-esteem will be. So it's definitely valuable for you to take some time to look at the two lists that you made and see where there are glaring differences. Sometimes it is that your perception of your real self needs some tweaking. Maybe you're being too hard on yourself. And other times it might be that our ideal self, the perception that we have of it, may be unattainable. So remember that perfection is not possible. Next, we'll look at biological perspectives about personality. You may remember from early chapters the Minnesota study of twins. This is a study that looked for the genetic basis of personality, and what they found is that identical twins, whether they were raised together or apart, have very similar personalities, and so this gives support to an idea of heritability. This just refers to the proportion of differences among people that is attributed to genetics. So we do see that, as is with everything about who you are, that there is a role that genetics plays in your personality development. It is not the sole contributor, however, to your personality. Temperament, you'll remember from the previous chapter, this is your kind of innate way of being, your level of emotional reactivity and sometimes responsivity. Next, we'll look at trait theorists. The trait theories of personality tend to be the dominant perspective and views about personality currently. You'll notice that these are actually extensions of the early theories of personality that I discussed in the very beginning of this. So traits are just characteristic ways of being, and some early theorists that again extended the work of those early ideas, Hippocrates and so on, were Allport, Cattle, and Hans and Sibyl Eysenck. So Allport noticed that there were many different ways that we can describe people, but he kind of whittled those down to three kinds of descriptions: cardinal, central, and secondary traits. Cattle narrowed down this list even further to 171, or 16 factors or dimensions, and those are what now, by Hans and Sibyl Eysenck, have been kind of narrowed down even further to 2 dimensions. So those 16 factors are typically looked at on the 2 dimensions of extroversion and introversion and neuroticism stability. And so we tend to see these as stable characteristics or unstable characteristics. So if you look at the picture here, what you can see is where those traits fall. And so we can see that they can be beneficial or not beneficial depending on whether or not they are stable or unstable. The 5-factor model of trait theory is looking specifically at these 5 characters. There has been a lot of research that have shown that these particular traits are effective in letting us kind of predict and recognize behavior in people. So they are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or ocean. And you can see that if we score low for each of these traits, that there are certain outcomes. If we score high, there are also other outcomes, okay? We'll look now at cultural perspectives of personality. So culture plays a large role in every aspect of who you are, including and especially your personality. Culture is all of the beliefs, the customs, the art, and traditions of a particular society. The strength of personality traits varies across cultures. For example, if you are in a collectivist versus an individualistic culture, the strength of certain traits is going to vary. We all live in an individualistic culture as Americans. Some of you, though, came initially from collectivist cultures, and so the difference between those is the focus on community versus the focus on the individual. And that thinking, that kind of zeitgeist, does very much shape your individual personality. There's also an idea of selective migration. This applies within the US and otherwise, and this is where we see that different areas within the US and outside of the US tend to have archetypes for personalities. And this is believed potentially to be because of selective migration, which is the idea that people will move to areas that are most suited for their personality traits. For example, I am a California girl. So there are a couple of different ways that we can study personality under the cultural context. One is through the cultural comparative approach, and this seeks to test Western ideas about personality in other cultures to determine whether they can be generalized and if they have cultural validity. There could be some challenges to this, however, because it's looking at another culture through the lens of your own culture, which means that there are lots of biases that can be placed and lots of things that can be missed because of the differences in cultural understanding. The indigenous approach has led to the development of personality assessment instruments that are based on constructs relevant to the culture that's being studied. So this is a more culture-based approach instead of looking through the lens of another culture. The combined approach serves as a bridge between these two, and it's a way to try to understand both universal and specific variations in personality. We'll look now at personality assessments. There are self-report inventories or measures, and these are just items, usually paper or computer-based, that allow an individual to provide a self-report about their personality traits, about their thinking and their behavior, and that typically is trait-based and allows for a summary that's fairly accurate usually of the way that the person thinks and behaves. An example is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. This is a personality test composed of a series of true and false questions in order to establish a clinical profile of an individual. You may have also heard of the Myers-Briggs. I will put a couple of inventories in the chapter folder for you to play with, including one that is like the Myers-Briggs. It's going to be called the Jung typology. So you'll have two. You'll have one for the Big Five traits and one for Jung typology. There are also projective tests, and these projective tests are very much under psychoanalytic perspective. Remember that Freud's belief in the unconscious. Okay, so projective tests are relying on tools to try to bring out unconscious desires or thinking or perspectives. So projective test is a personality assessment in which a person responds to ambiguous stimuli, revealing hidden feelings, impulses, and desires. One is the Rorschach inkblot test. You may be familiar with the Rorschach test by seeing pictures. There are lots of references in books, movies, TV. There's even a character in superhero franchise that is called Rorschach. So the projective test that employs a series of symmetrical inkblot cards that are presented to a client by a psychologist in an effort to reveal the person's unconscious desires, fears, and struggles. There's also the thematic apperception test, which is used a little more frequently than the Rorschach. It's a projective test in which people are presented with ambiguous images, and they can then make up stories to go with the images in an effort to uncover their unconscious desires, fears, and struggles. An extension of this is the Rotter Incomplete Sentence blank, the Contemporized Themes Concerning Blacks test, and the TMS Multicultural Thematic Apperception test. So the first is a projective test that is similar to a word association test, in which a person completes sentences in order to reveal their unconscious desires, fears, and struggles. The second is, again, similar to the other thematic perception test, but is a more culturally relevant for African Americans. And the final is more culturally relevant, particularly for Hispanic youth.